Hello, this is Delaney Atkinson, and this is my CAA number 3, a historical timeline. I've made a chronological list of laws and cases affecting bilingual education. Brown versus Board of Education happened in 1954. The National Defense Education Act occurred in 1958. The Civil Rights Act went into effect in 1964. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act went into effect in 1965. The Bilingual Education Act was in 1968. Lau versus Nichols case was in 1970. The Equal Educational Opportunities Act was in 1974. And Proposition 227 was in 1998. No Child Left Behind Act was in 2001, and Every Student Succeeds Act was in 2015. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. The court case Brown versus Board of Education outlawed segregation of schools, citing unequal education offered at segregated schools to be unfair. Brown versus Board of Education has been a landmark case for education, making it clear that students should be allowed equal educational opportunities, which paved the way for future high-quality bilingual education programs. Though this case did not specifically address bilingual education, it started the conversation about equal education for all students, and was undoubtedly of great importance for the future of bilingual education. The National Defense Education Act, 1958. The National Defense Education Act was passed, it is said, in response to the Soviet satellite Sputnik, and was the first national effort to fortify instruction in mathematics, science, and foreign language instruction. This initial government emphasis on strengthening core education was likely our first taste at what was to come with regard to the ESEA, then the NCLB Act, and later the ESSA. For ELLs, this was a time of falling into the cracks. As the race for intellectual advancement was on, those who could not comprehend the language being taught would inevitably fall behind their peers. Civil Rights Act, 1964. The Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination on the basis of national origin, race, or sex. This act was surely beneficial for most minority students, but because the attention at the time was mostly directed at the discrimination faced by African American students, de facto, in fact, and de jure, by law, segregation of Mexican American children throughout the Southwest remained prevalent. Though this act did not effectively integrate all students at first, it was a step in the right direction, and a big one. Elementary and Secondary Education Act, 1965. The ESEA specifically addressed the educational needs of impoverished children. The ESEA called for federal funding, policy, and procedure that specifically was targeted to those of little means. The federal assistance typically makes up less than 10% of overall funding, but every state is subject to federal education law. Because many students whose primary language is not English come from immigrant families who may only just be establishing in America and not be financially fit yet, the ESEA undoubtedly would benefit many ELL students. The Bilingual Education Act, 1968. The Bilingual Education Act was the initial commitment by the U.S. government to assist students with limited English skills. It was also referred to as Title VII of the ESEA, and it specifically addresses bilingual education through the authorization of resources by training teachers and aides. It helps to develop instructional materials and to involve parents in their children's education. This act originally did not include a definition of bilingual education, which left room for misinterpretation and misapplication of funding. Though it took 7 reauthorizations to be finalized, there was an inherent and constant goal maintained throughout to help English language learners achieve fluency in English. Lau versus Nichols case, 1970. The Lau versus Nichols court case originated from an impassioned poverty lawyer who strove to address the injustice of a child who was failing in school because they didn't understand the language of instruction. The ruling in this case was such that a consent agreement was signed stating that bilingual education would be provided for the city's Chinese, Filipino, and Hispanic children. The Lau remedies were specific guidelines that districts were to use to identify and address the instruction of English language learning students. This eventually led to President Carter proposing the Lau regulations, the controversial and later withdrawn attempt at enforcing the Lau remedies. The Equal Educational Opportunities Act, 1974. The EEOA says that there should be appropriate action taken on behalf of students to overcome language barriers that may impede student participation in instructional programs. Specifically, in the case of Castaneda versus Pickard, the court relied on the EEOA and was able to mandate special help for English learners. This case also specified what appropriate action meant, as based on a sound educational theory implemented effectively and with adequate resources and personnel, and after a trial, must be evaluated for effectiveness in aiding students to overcome language handicaps. Proposition 227, 1998. The highly contentious Proposition 227 passed in California in 1998 and proceeded to eliminate bilingual education across the state, aside from San Francisco and San Jose, where a prior court decision protected bilingual education. Because Proposition 227 placed inappropriate restrictions on bilingual education programs, it was later repealed by Proposition 58 in 2016. The new proposition emphasized that students are to become proficient in English, but that dual language immersion programs would be authorized for districts to implement for both native and non-native English speakers. No Child Left Behind Act. The NCLB was a reauthorization and renaming of the ESEA, signed into law by President George W. Bush. This controversial act labeled bilingual students to be limited English proficient and did little for or against bilingual programs. A large part of NCLB was to place much emphasis on accountability through high-stakes testing. English language learners were made to take these tests as well, regardless of their proficiency in English. An adjustment was eventually enacted that provided to exempt those ELLs who had been in the U.S. for less than 1 year. This act tended to result in districts teaching to the test and was deemed by most to be unrealistic and highly flawed in both major political parties, until its long-awaited end. The Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, signed into law by President Obama, the ESSA sets standards and testing requirements similarly to the NCLB, but provides states with much greater flexibility regarding the establishment of school accountability programs. The ESSA requires ELLs to be tested on the standardized tests as well, but with some accommodation, such as testing can be done in their native language for a number of years, and this act is an improvement upon the NCLB Act. But due to the reality that the majority of ELLs will only be assessed in English across the country, we've by no means found a utopian act here. Okay, so basically, I would like to recap and just kind of point out that though this is what's in effect right now, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and I said it's no utopian act, I do think that all of these have been progressively getting better and we're heading in the right direction. So it does feel like there are still issues in our educational system, but I like to think that we have more people from more backgrounds coming together to be productive for the benefit of all students. So good things to come. Thank you.